All right. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today to take part in this really important conference and to share a few thoughts on work that I've been doing on the question of police legitimacy. I want to focus on issues to do with just providing a basic understanding of what we mean by legitimacy, because it seems to me it is such a fundamental issue in police work. The effectiveness of the police to do the sort of things that Christopher has been talking about, and for many other aspects of police work, depends on the legitimacy of the police. And we have seen globally what happens when police legitimacy is at risk. The main point I want to try to convey today is that when we talk about legitimacy, our main concern is with the rightfulness of power. Legitimacy is not necessarily about the ability of the police to project fear or to threaten punishment. Of course, punishment itself needs to be seen to be legitimate for it to make a difference in the offending behaviors of citizens. Secondly, we will emphasize the point that legitimacy should always be seen as relational, as a continuous dialogue between police officers and the multiple audiences that they are dealing with. And that when it comes to building legitimacy, the focus should not just be on the legality of police work. Of course, lawfulness is important, but also effective use of authority and the fairness of police conduct. And as we will see shortly, this fairness includes both processes and decisions. And that legitimacy is important because we have some evidence suggesting that it can promote voluntary acceptance of police decisions, and also people who perceive authorities to be legitimate are more likely to obey the law and to provide information about crime in their local area to the police. I start with this graph. As you know, Google allows you to track changes or how many times a particular word or phrase has been used in various publications over time. And when we do that for police legitimacy and criminal deterrence, you find this interesting trajectory. So as you can see, until about the early 1990s, much of the references in the literature was to criminal deterrence. But since the 1990s, we have this really significant surge in references to police legitimacy. And part of this has to be or at least it coincides with the publication of Tyler's book, Why People Obey the Law, which then has led to this significant growth in various empirical studies on legitimacy and its role in criminal justice. But unlike deterrence, which often assumes that people are rational, calculative agents and that they seek to maximize gain and reduce pain, and therefore we can influence behavior through the use of incentives and sanctions. legitimacy makes a different kind of assumption. And the assumption is that people are moral agents, such that their behavior, their decisions, their judgments are based on their sense of what is right and wrong in a particular setting. And precisely because of that, the political theorist David Beetham makes the point that if indeed people are moral agents, then we cannot expect to influence their law, um, their compliance behavior by relying on incentives and sanctions alone. We also need to pay attention to how they perceive the normative status of power holders, such as police officers, to be. And when we talk about normative status, we are talking about the legitimacy of the police or of legal authorities. Now, what do we mean by legitimacy? A critical issue when we think about legitimacy is power that is recognized or acknowledged as being rightful. So it's not power that is feared. It is not power that is perceived to be intimidating, but power that people voluntarily recognize, acknowledge, accept as being rightful. And I want to highlight a few things in this definition. One is what you might call the normative character of legitimacy. And what we mean by normative character here is that whenever we are talking about legitimacy, we are presupposing the existence of shared values and norms in society. That is an important point to note, that legitimacy always presupposes the existence of shared values or norms. And we can come back to that point, especially given the kind of different values that we might find in any society. The second is that legitimacy is always conditional. It is dynamic. It is not static. So we might start with a certain level of legitimacy regarding particular aspects of police strategy or policy or powers. And that legitimacy might be lost over time because of certain conduct or the lack of it by the police. The third point is that legitimacy is not a one-off transaction. It is a continuous dialogue with police officers constantly making claims to have the right to exercise different powers, and citizens responding in different ways to those claims. I also want to highlight, before I return to the issue of the dialogic nature of legitimacy, to say that when we think about legitimacy, we should think about these two dimensions. One is what you call audience legitimacy, which is how citizens perceive the police, whether they are victims, whether they are suspect or they are offenders. How do they perceive the legitimacy of the police? The other dimension is how police officers themselves view their own legitimacy. Do they think are they convinced that they have the right to exercise the power, the authority that is vested in them? So let me return to the issue of dialogic nature of legitimacy, because I think this is a really central point to bear in mind. And it is that we are encouraged to see legitimacy as a fluid concept, right? A dynamic concept, one that is contingent on the kind of conversations, the kind of narratives, the kinds of dialogues that might be happening in a particular society. A dialogue about what might be appropriate police behavior, a dialogue about the extent of police powers, a dialogue about what kinds of police behavior people might consider acceptable or not. The reason we should think about it as a dialogue is that whether we are researchers or we are policymakers or we are practitioners, a dialogue necessarily draws our attention to the particular context in which policing happens. Because as we know, dialogues don't take place in a vacuum. They take place within a particular socio-economic and historical context. So how is that context influencing the kind of expectations that people have of the police? How is that context shaping the way that policing is done in ways that might build or not build legitimacy? Secondly, when we think about a dialogue as opposed to a monologue, we are interested in who are the parties to this dialogue. Who are the power holders? What kinds of police officers are we talking about here? Are there other power holders within that society, maybe civil society groups, courts, and others who might have some influence on what the police do? What is the nature of the influence that they bring to bear on the police? We also then will have to think about who the audiences of police powers are. Victims, suspects, what kind of victims, what kind of suspects are they? But more crucially, we then also are forced to consider what the expectations of the audiences are. What expectations do citizens have of the police? And I want to especially highlight four key expectations of the police that, when they are met in different contexts, can help to build legitimacy of the police. I am not in any way suggesting that this would always equally be important to citizens in every context. This is more of a hypothesis on the issues that citizens might find important or that matters to them. The first is effectiveness of power, lawfulness, procedural justice, and distributive justice. And I just want to have a quick go through these ones. The first, of course, is it's a pretty straightforward issue because why do we have the police? We have the police because society has a problem of disorder and we need the police to contribute towards fulfilling or meeting or addressing that disorder problem. And as we have seen from Christobal's presentation, we know what might work in addressing those problems. But the basic point here is that police will be seen as legitimate if they meet an important expectation of being effective in dealing with crime problems in local communities. The second issue is lawfulness. And here, I think anytime we are talking about police legitimacy, many people will start from the issue of lawfulness, that to the extent that police powers are provided for in law, that to some is sufficient to build legitimacy. We cannot say that. We have to say that lawfulness is necessary, but not sufficient. But of course, uh, lawfulness requires that police actions are consistent with the law and that they are accountable in many ways to the law for what they do. And that the more citizens perceive them to be accountable, to be lawful, the more they will consider them to be legitimate. The third issue is procedural justice. And procedural justice here concerns how people feel the police treat them when they interact with them, whether you go with their stop at the traffic or they are invited to the police station or they are arrested or they have been victims of crime. How fairly do the police treat them? And the research we have suggests that there are four really important considerations when people think about whether a process is fair or not. the issue of voice, the issue of trustworthy motives, respect, and impartiality. And I'll just have a quick go on that. So when we talk about voice, we are essentially concerned about the extent to which people, for example, victims or any other groups who deal with the police, are offered the opportunity to tell their side of the story before the police make a decision. Do the police listen to them? Do they hear what they say? Do they appear to take that into account as they make a decision? Or you have a situation where the officer says, no, 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 you should shut up. If you have anything to say, you can tell it to the judge. Well, the evidence we have suggests that people want the police, they want legal authorities to hear them, to listen to them, and to take what they say into account. The second is that, of course, when people are dealing with the police, they are not entirely sure what the motives of the police are. So they are concerned about information that might convey to them what the motives of the police are. And we know from the work that Tom Tyler and others have done that these are some of the ways that the police can convey an impression that they can be trusted, that their motives are sincere. So, for example, do they explain the purpose of the process that they are using to deal with people's cases? What reasons, if at all, do they, if any, do they give for their decisions? Do they come across as being sincere and caring, especially the tone of voice, the questions that they ask? Or you have a situation where the police are seen to be trying to trick people into incriminating themselves, or they come across as being unapproachable and intimidating. Then we have the issue of impartiality. And here, the key point here is whether the police are seen as neutral or impartial arbiters, or the officers have already made up their minds about the guilt or otherwise of individuals. And this is an important issue. And one way to try to convey the issue of impartiality, of course, would be whether the police listen, whether they explain the rules, and that they are consistent in the way that they apply the law when they deal with people's cases. And this, of course, means that police have to try to make greater use of evidence and the rules rather than their personal views. And because as soon as you open that door to personal views, all sorts of prejudice and other things are allowed in. Finally, when we think about procedural justice, we're talking about respectful treatment as well. So how do police deal with or interact with members of the public? What tone do they use? What phrases? Are they courteous, or they are using language that might come across as being offensive and disrespectful to citizens, whether they are victims or suspects or just bystanders looking in, as it were? So we've seen that when we think about legitimacy, we are thinking about effectiveness, lawfulness, procedural justice. And the fourth element I highlighted was that of distributive justice. So here, one way to encapsulate this is whether the police are seen to be discriminating against, say, poor victims, discriminating against people of a particular race or ethnic group, religious group, such that the way they, for example, they investigate crime, or they spend a lot of resources investigating crimes against the rich and the powerful, but do not take the victimization of the poor and the marginalized seriously. So anytime that there is a sense or an element of discrimination or partiality in police work, we are thinking in terms of distributive justice. And when we look across many places where the police have had difficulties with local communities, one of the issues have been distributive injustice, that the police are seen to be discriminatory in the way that they enforce the law. And Tom Tyler makes this, I think, really important point, that all these things I've discussed, in many ways, the test is not in the pronouncements that the police make. You can buy all the airtime, you can do all the propaganda or publicity about how fair, how respectful, how legitimate you are. The test is during the everyday interactions that people have with the police. And his point is that it is during these interactions that people learn about the lawfulness of the police, the effectiveness of the police, how fairly they treat citizens, and whether they discriminate against citizens or not. Because of time, I will hurry up and just cover a couple of other things. So this is just to provide you a model that I have been writing about, that legitimacy has these four important elements which influence people's um, sense of obligation to obey the authorities. And once they feel an obligation to obey, it tends to translate into these behavioral outcomes. And there's a lot of correlational evidence from correlational studies that support this model. Just to highlight some of the work, the evidence that we know, this is a study from California by Tom Tyler showing the importance of procedural justice in influencing people's decisions to accept, willingness to accept police decisions. Okay. Another study I find really interesting, this is not necessarily correlational, but a study that looked at how people who are suspected of spousal assault, whether their experiences of treatment in the hands of the police affect the likelihood that they will reoffend. And this is a staggering kind finding. The study shows that people who perceive the police to have treated them fairly were only 25% likely to reoffend, as opposed to 40% in the cases of those who said the police had treated them unfairly. So I will just end with this matrix and welcome your questions, which is to say, I remember I mentioned self-legitimacy and audience legitimacy. I think this is one area we need some innovative research to see how levels of self-legitimacy correlates with audience legitimacy, any gaps, any strain, and what happens when there is a mismatch. So for example, you might ideally find a police service in this cell, high self-legitimacy, high audience legitimacy. But when a police service is in this area, officers have high sense of their own legitimacy, but the public might not think the same. There you have some of the public disorder and crisis situations that we often see. Okay. Sorry that I have to rush through this, but I've included some readings. If you are interested, I'm happy to have the PowerPoint sent out to you. Thank you very much for your attention.